This is the message of the gospel that we proclaim. That God, the all-powerful, mighty creator of the universe, is one in three, and three are one. Concept known as the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Not three parts that make a God, not one God divided into three parts, but the Trinity. The one are three, the three are one. He is one awesome God, and it's almost impossible to explain. The Trinity, you can only say what the Trinity is not. From time immemorial, before the foundations of the earth were laid, God knew that human beings would create it, and God knew that they would fall, and that they would be an act of rebellion to Him and covered in sin, and therefore unfit to spend the rest of eternity in His presence. He knew that human beings would be helpless and hopeless and unable to achieve their own salvation, so He chose instead to move and act to save them when they could not save themselves. And one person of the Trinity, known as the Son, agreed that He would take off His robes of glory and power and majesty, come to earth and be born in a human body, to live amongst human beings, and ultimately to die on the cross as a human being to pay for and atone for the sins of the world, yours, mine, and all other human beings who would ever be born. And that, as John 3:16 says, whosoever believes in Him will not perish, but have eternal life. It's a gift you don't earn. It's something you don't deserve. It's something you can't attain. It's not awarded by merit or by favor or by being better looking or being more intelligent. It is a free gift for whosoever believes, and that's eternal life. But the interesting thing is, when you dig through Scripture and you start reading, there will be these moments when you'll bump across a passage that's almost a little bit troubling, that sort of defies the odds. And one of them I always found to bother me immensely was Matthew chapter 25. And probably the first time it really began to resonate in my heart and trouble me was when years ago I was working in a very large, flashy, big monster church. We were a little bit arrogant and prideful, thinking we were the best show in town, and we were the best show in town. We had a $1.2 million a year budget, and we spent about $40,000 helping poor people and dealing with missions, and it was a pittance giveaway. And it feels like we're doing great stuff until you read Matthew chapter 25, and you would come across a statement like this in verse 31. Jesus talking, He would say, "But when the Son of Man comes in His glory and all His angels with Him, then He will sit upon His glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered in His presence, and He will separate them as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep at His right hand and the goats at His left. Then the King will say to those on His right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, visited me.' And then these righteous ones will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the King will tell them, 'I assure you, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me.' And then the King will turn to those on His left, and He will say, 'Away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons. For I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty. You didn't give me anything to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me no clothing. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me.' And then they will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you?' And He will answer, 'I assure you, when you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you are refusing to help me.' And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life." I always found that passage troubling because it seems like, for all the idea of a free gift, it seems like, well, in the end, there's this reward being offered based on what you do. It's bothered some scholars so much they say, oh yeah, that's a Old Testament passage that Jesus was talking about. It actually shouldn't belong in the New Testament. We don't even know what to do with it. It's bothered them so much. And yet it was troubling for me to realize, I was in a church that had a $150,000 PA system and lighting system, and we didn't really do dip work. And so I began to look at that and think, what God was saying in this, He's saying, here's how you know if your belief is true. If you've encountered the real Jesus and you got the real thing, here's how it's measured. How do you treat the least in society? The most broken, the most lost, the most wounded, the most helpless. The measuring stick is this. How deep and far and wide does your compassion go to the people that society considers the most worthless? That's the measuring rod. I was realizing, man, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. This Christmas season, we decided that instead of spending a little time just sort of kind of, for me, years and years and years in church, I mean, how many times can you hear about Mary on a donkey, right? I wanted to do something a little bit different. And I decided, let's do a compassionate Christmas series. Let's talk to some people who have given up their lives and surrendered their careers and their ambitions and the gains they could have had in order to achieve some stuff personally instead of giving it back to a society that is the least and the lost. And today I've asked Jerry Schwab, who's the director of counseling and the services for case management from Catholic Charities, to come and spend this morning with us. And I'm just going to do a little interview with Jerry and his life. Would you please welcome Jerry Schwab as he comes? Yay, Jerry, come on up. I'm gonna come down here and get my coffee because I'm gonna be sipping coffee while we talk here. Jerry and I go back a ways. I'm still the current chairman of the Spokane Homeless Coalition, and I'll be maintaining that role till the end of this year, and then a new guy will take over. So I've met an awful lot of people in an awful lot of roles. And Jerry, you were a guy I met years ago when we were doing the meals downtown, and you were at House of Charity. So before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about Catholic Charities in general. What is it Catholic Charities actually does in this area?
Well, before we start, I think you've said enough and we can all go watch the Seahawks now. We've been fed sufficiently. And I like to call Catholic Charities the other white meat. The early service got that. What's up with that? They're laughing again, but Union Gospel Mission does a tremendous marketing campaign. They're in all the magazines that I open these days, and they're on billboards, and they're on TV, and they're on the radio, and they do a tremendous service. And we're the other organization in town, but there's a distinction between what Catholic Charities and what Union Gospel Mission does. Union Gospel Mission evangelizes to people and tries to bring them to Christ, and that's an awesome endeavor. And they are a clean and sober organization, facility. The people that come to the Union Gospel Mission must not use drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, I think you have to pass a breathalyzer to get a bed there at night.
Yeah, they have a different filter. Catholic Charities, I'll go on to tell you more specifically, but Catholic Charities does 2 shelters. We do the House of Charity. It's a 110-bed male shelter. During the day, it's men and women all day long for meals and clothing and hygiene products and showers and towels and companionship. And St. Margaret's Shelter is 17 units of housing for women and their kids. St. Anne's Daycare Center has 200 slots. It's over across from the main building under Sacred Heart Hospital. We do immigration. We help undocumented individuals in this region get legal services. And more recently, the fires that devastated the northern counties, we realized that Red Cross and other service organizations were able to deliver relief to people who were documented, but undocumented were really out of luck and in a devastated place. So we created a response to that. We do developmentally disabled housing. We do single parenting classes. We have about 13 programs, and we serve Eastern Washington. We do migrant farm worker housing in Othello, and we have under construction a 50-unit housing project on 2nd Avenue near this interesting Spokane icon, the Spokane Motel, on east of Dick's Burgers on 2nd. There's some land, and we were able to get tax credit financing to build a 50-unit project for people to get them off the streets into housing. Volunteers of America will build a 50-unit project next door, open in the fall. We built one behind the House of Charity, Father Bachhaven. It's 50 units. We have purchased some land across from the House of Charity to build another one, and we'll probably build 3 or 4 before we're done. So we have over 1,000 units of housing in Eastern Washington for low-income seniors and for homeless individuals.
So when I first was part of the Spokane Homeless Coalition, was just learning, I came to realize within a couple of years that Catholic Charities was massively involved in the social society of Spokane. I tell people this even all the time. I say, if Catholic Charities disappeared from Spokane, our society would be devastated with the fallout and the impact. It'd be suddenly, where did all these poor people come from? Where did all these mentally ill people come from? Where did all these addicts come from? And the answer is they've always been here. Catholic Charities have been taking care of them. The city government does it, the state. Catholic Charities has been on that front edge, quietly doing work that many people don't want to do and certainly don't want to see, but it has been a huge change in keeping Spokane functioning healthy and in a happy way. And I don't even know if you know this, we would not actually have this church if it weren't for Catholic Charities. We ran out of money last November, and a $50,000 grant from Catholic Charities helped us finish this construction and open this church. So, yay for the Catholics. So, Jerry, what's your role inside that organization?
I have a mental health staff of counselors, case managers, and more recently a peer counselor who see people who call for services, for counseling services at our main office. And then we have a 21-unit project on 2nd and Wall in the Collins apartments above the SNAP offices, where we get people who are the most difficult people in the city and we put them into housing. So the city has created a system called the SPDAT, which is a vulnerability index, and chronically homeless individuals come and share aspects of their life, and you get points for having diabetes and COPD and for having a heart condition. You get points for being mentally ill, for being an addict, for being homeless. There's a whole lot of measures, and the Collins gets the people that are the toughest in the city. We have an individual we staffed last week that was to the emergency room 40 times in the last 30 days. So people who live on the streets go to the emergency room. They get drunk and they fall on their heads and they get concussions and hypothermia. They get attacked, literally, by individuals who prey on them. And it costs the city a ton of money. We created a respite program at the House of Charity so that individuals who are hospitalized, because you can't discharge someone with an amputation to the sidewalk, or with an oxygen tank, or with a triple bypass. So we figured out a way to designate some of the shelter beds for respite, for a Providence Healthcare respite program. So it's interesting, housed people stay in the hospital an average of 4 nights. Homeless people are double that, because how do you let a person go who's in that vulnerable of a state? They just end up coming back. Their wounds don't get wound care. Their meds aren't attended to. So we found a way to make the shelter relevant to that need, that community need, and it's now got 20 beds. You mentioned that what would be the impact if some of this stuff went away? Well, we'll find out January 1st, because funding for the House of Charity is literally dried up. Government funding used to be 2/3 FEMA, HUD, other government grants would fund shelters, and now the government believes that they can't do that anymore. They're concentrating on housing. So January 1st, there won't be mail service at the House of Charity anymore, potentially. We get mail for over 3,000 people at the shelter. We might not have gear storage. So we're having to scale down our services. We're possibly going to close the doors at noon and then not reopen the rest of the day, except let people up the stairs into their beds at 7:30 at night. There will be more individuals at River Park Square, at the library, in downtown, because we were providing a day service for them. But we're looking at a $300,000 cut. So the government funding has shifted toward housing, and that's where my other project benefits, because funding is going toward getting people straight from the street straight into housing. So the shelters are kind of being cut out of the equation. And truth is, some people stay in the shelter a long, long time. They don't go to housing. We've had people in our shelter for decades. It's their home. And in some instances, that's okay. In some instances, it's better than the alternative. Some of our folks stay too long, and they really do need to step up their game and get into housing. So we're doing that. But our housing project is a tough project. We take people that are still using meth and heroin, and we put them in an apartment. And so 24/7, my case managers work around the clock, and my graveyard staff, to try and keep the peace. We have the most expensive, the toughest individuals in our community in that building right now. And was telling the earlier group, we have an individual who is elderly, has every illness in the book, and everybody else has fired him. He's burned all his bridges. Mental health is saying we can't see him anymore. But he lays in the hall and he screams bloody murder in the middle of the night. And if you go up to him and say, dude, you gotta be quiet. You gotta quiet down. Other people are trying to sleep. He'll yell through you. And then if you say, if we call the ambulance, he'll refuse transport because you can't take a person on a 911 trip without their consent. So he's with us.
When you're so bad, mental health won't see you anymore. You're really bad. And it's weird in society because classically our whole model has been, if you're willing to get clean and sober, we'll house you. We'll find a place for you to live. And that's pretty much been the model for years and years. And it's shifting now because the realization is you can't wait for people to get clean and sober. What happens is, as you mentioned, they're falling down, they're getting drunk, they're calling 911, they're showing up in the emergency room 40 times in a 30-day period. And I know because we work with Providence Healthcare and others, Providence Healthcare says it's $1,500 a pop on average for someone to walk into the emergency room. So that street drunk is in the emergency room 30, 40 times in a couple months period. He's costing more to the county in social service dollars than if we'd have just gotten him an apartment and let him live inside an apartment for an MBK span. So there's been this new shift where people said it's easier now to actually take people who are still addicts, who are still drinking, who are still tough and on the streets. Let's get them free apartments to live in, and we'll cover it for the tax stuff. That's cheaper than letting them live on the street in the long run. It's just a really tough sell to talk to the guy who's busting his rear 40 hours a week at Walmart that some of his tax money is going to go to give this guy downtown a free apartment so he could stay drunk. That's a tough sell. The only way to understand it is it's an economic deal. It's the handful of individuals who are literally costing the county millions in our area. The Spokane Municipal Court refers to them as hotspotters, and there's a small handful who are eating up massive amounts of our social service dollars by calling 911, by being in jail, by walking into the emergency room a lot. So what you guys are doing is saying, hey, if we could house these 21 individuals or 40 individuals, it will save everybody a lot of money, but they just need to understand what's behind. And we've heard it as wet housing, which the state doesn't like. We've heard of this housing first models. There's a lot of different names that are thrown around for it. But the idea is, you can stay using. You can stay an alcoholic. You can stay whatever condition you're in, and we'll just get you a free apartment, get you off the street. And that's the new model, away from shelters towards that. And you guys are willing to not only build the housing, but you're willing to case manage them once they're in there and talk to them at length. And we know, because in the old church we had several of them. We had a guy named Harley who used to come. We called him O2 because he always dragged around an oxygen tank with him. And we just, hey, O2, and you can light up a cigarette, get away from the doors. It was outside the building. But man, he was ornery and cantankerous. He could no longer go to the place where he would get his oxygen tanks. He wasn't allowed in there anymore because he was so mean. I don't know. He probably yelled and cussed out everybody. I think he yelled and cussed out you once pretty bad, didn't he, August? Yeah, that kind of thing. So he was the guy that we considered a spiritual gain when we taught him not to use the term mother effer in the old ladies Sunday school on the first service down there. Literally, it's like that was front edge. And I say, okay, I guess that's spiritual growth. That's spiritual growth. So these are the people you're willing to say, we'll pick up and we'll love on them and we'll work with them. And you're the guy kind of coordinating teams of people. And you've been doing this how long?
39 years.
39 years. You've been working with the group that the Bible would refer to as the least in society. In your 39 years, Jerry, what have you learned?
Well, the beauty of serving the least is that the discoveries that you make of these individuals' lives and what they're made of. And, lately when someone hits the news because they are a war victim in Afghanistan or Iraq, when they step in an IED and they lose their lives, they're really upheld as heroes. The term hero is used now a lot for people who die to the service of our country. But I want to tell you that many of the folks that I have met have lived in war zones too, but the war zones are their families. As children, there was violence and threats, abuse, and the stress level was epic. And you live hour to hour, moment to moment when you live in a household where people are using meth and hurting each other and hurting and threatening you. So I've met so many people who have had such levels of trauma and abuse, and yet they're wonderful people. They're kind and compassionate and giving. T. James, I went to the general store with him one day, and T. James had been 35 years in foster homes, prison, jail, was abused as a child sexually. We're at the general store, and we're buying something for the shelter, and I say, and there was all these duffel bags sitting by the cash register. I said, "Oh, today you get a free duffel bag with a purchase," to the cashier, and she laughed and said no. And T. James paid attention, and later on in the day, he brought me a duffel bag because he thought I needed a duffel bag. It was like awesome. This guy was intuitive to other people's needs. Though he had suffered the amount of pain he had, he was tuned into other people's pain and their needs. Another gentleman, Clarence, volunteered at the House of Charity. He came to us from the Sukiyaki Inn. He was born in Hawaii. Clarence volunteered about 40,000 hours at the House of Charity for free, doing dishes 6 to 7 hours a day for decades. And he made origami dollar bills and sometimes other denominations of bills. And he gave them to people that came to the shelter. He put them on a straw. It was one of those little bird origamis. And then if you blew on them, they twirled. And he gave them to thousands of people. And when he wasn't doing that, he was at the Red Lion drinking beer. But he was amazing, amazing creature of giving. I'd go into the kitchen and I'd be looking for something, maybe the pepper, and Clarence would come up and hand me the pepper without me telling him I was looking for the pepper. And I don't know how many times Clarence had developed the ability as a human being, who Clarence was partially deaf, by the way. Clarence was able to pick up on people's signals and needs and anticipate it to the degree that he would hand them what they needed without them asking for it. And you know how many times you and I go through the week thinking we need something or want something and we're pissed off because we don't get it? I mean, isn't that kind of life? Isn't that sort of part of life, is that there's something we need and want and desire and we're not getting it and we're unhappy about it? But more than ever in my life at the House of Charity, I've met people who were givers, who had that kind of instinct, who anticipate. I will drive up to the House of Charity and there's a conversation I'm going to have with somebody because I need to get them a speaking engagement or make a connection. And as I drive into the parking lot, they walk up toward my car. It's like, I don't even have to look for them. And there's a lot of people at the House of Charities, like 300 people a day come in the doors. And you never know who's going to be there at what time. It's pretty random. But the manna existence, the daily bread, the gifts, the giving that happens in the workplace that I work in is phenomenal.
Jerry, talk a little about the faith, too. The people at that level have nothing, and yet still have this understanding of Jesus and God, and they see God in all just this daily prayers that get answered.
Yeah, I had a long history with T. James. I went to his funeral, and I spoke at his funeral, and the story I told about T. James was, the Alton's brake commercial that makes you nervous when you hear it, where they say, "Do your brakes do this?" And they make these awful sounds. And then you're driving your car and you think, I hope I don't have to get a brake job because it'll be $400 or $500. What I said about T. James was he was like a brake system that had lost all its pads. So as a human being, he had been worn down through all of life's tragedy. He once tried to commit suicide. He jumped off a cliff and he landed on a thorn bush. So the thorn bush saved his life. And then a church bus was passing by on the way to delivering congregation members to the service, and they picked him up, and he was a mess. They took up a collection at the service for him. The pastor put him in a motel room where he recovered. T. James tried to commit suicide multiple times. He lived in the sewer for a while, and one day, and he came to Central United Methodist Church on 3rd and Howard somewhere in his life and became a volunteer. He started sweeping, mopping, buffing, cleaning the floors, and the floors were his domain. And he was a repairman. He was a giver. He also gave thousands and thousands of hours to Central United Methodist Church. But he was wound tight, He was, personality-wise, he was pretty intense. And one day in the kitchen, I don't know what I asked him to do or what I said to him, but he yelled through me, just like one of those horns at a football game. He yelled, "Jerry, don't you know I'm mentally ill? Don't you know I have nothing? I have nothing but Christ." And so in a brake system for T. James, Christ was the center disc. And his contact with Christ was huge. It was like the Alton's brake commercial. His brake pads were gone. So when he came together with Christ, it was intense. And his faith was immense. Now, you and I, typically, those of us in this room have brake pads that get in the way of our contact with Christ. Because of privilege, because of wealth, status, comfort, our material possessions. When we try and get connected to Christ, there's a lot of stuff that gets in the way. But for some of the homeless people, their connection with Christ is direct. And there's people that have nothing but a Bible. They have no license, no home. They have nothing but their Bible and their faith and their prayers. And so it's a beauty to be around them. They minister to me, the richness of their faith. They're like the woman in the gospel that has a penny who puts it in the collection plate. So that's like 100% tithing. That's like giving 100% of your penny, as opposed to many of us who fall short of that. We have a lot.
Most people think about, I'd love to help the poor. It's this noble endeavor. I'll go down and help these poor people climb out of their situation. But when you start doing it and you're down in the trenches for a long time, you realize there's a lot more what we would call failure stories than success. Because part of it is we think, if I help you and I do something nice for you, poor person, your responsibility then is to move up one rung in the social ladder. You need to respond positively to the help and aid I give you. And when you deal with people in the trenches, you don't get that response. And so year after year, it's kind of this struggle of trying to figure out how do you hang in there when the people that you're trying to help, they don't stop drinking. They don't stop using drugs. They still make bad choices. They do commit suicide. You watch a lot of them die. How do you stay in there?
Well, I think the poor are our ticket to heaven. I mean, unless you get a ticket from a poor person, I'm not sure we're getting through the gate. Which means you can't just hang around comfortable people and do comfortable things and live on cruise control. So when you do the work that we do, you have to dig deep into. You have to let God. You have to give it to God. I can't. I've been a counselor this whole time, but I don't fix other human beings. I don't have that kind of power. But God does, and God has a plan. The poor have a lot to teach us. They're experts. Sometimes they're incredible experts on what it's like to live the manna existence. And we sort of got delivered, and now we're sort of like the Israelites. We got stuff that we're hoarding, and God continually has told us not to do that. Don't I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. The homeless sort of live that existence because they're not doing it on their own, not through employment or education or status or achievement. They're vulnerable and they're dependent on the daily bread. Our society, so the newest gimmick is Thanksgiving, not Thanksgiving. And if you noticed, so there's an ad campaign coming out of Madison Avenue, and it's about my health care, my McDonald's, my restaurant, Happy Meals. There's a conspiracy in our country to make people me-oriented and me-centered. And that's how Madison Avenue thrives. That's how products are sold. It's all about me. It's making me. This is me, 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 me. That's, what age group says me, me, me? They're turning our country into a group of 2-year-olds. Immediate gratification, feed the need, Mountain Dew. We're so surrounded by the message of take care of me. This is mine. We're in trouble. Our country's in trouble because that's how we've been brainwashed. That it's all about me, and that's the antithesis of community. That's the antithesis of trust. It's the antithesis of vulnerability. Vulnerability results in care and compassion and comfort and love. And we're in a society that says, screw that stuff. Just get this stuff. Get this car. Get this house. Get this, get that. Get this product. And that's become clearer and clearer to me as I hang out with poor people, that we've got to change that. We have to change that orientation of immediate gratification. So I think the poor can teach us that when we hang out with them.
So, Jerry, describe your journey. I mean, you take a group of grade school kids and ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? And nobody's ever going to say, oh, I want to work with homeless people, right? Everybody wants to be a fireman and a policeman or a doctor or whatever. How does a guy take all of his intelligence and all of his career opportunities and all of his education and steer it towards the path you did? Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you get to where you are?
Well, it's all started when I graduated from high school at 5'4" as a nerd, and had to endure life as a teenager under siege in a dysfunctional family with really no one to talk to. So until I took a psychology class, I figured, whoa, this makes some sense around what's going on in my life. So I wanted to study it at college, and I did, and I wanted more and more, and I got more and more, and I kept getting more education, and I kept being in jobs that were way beyond my capability. I was outmatched time and time and time again, as I am now. Right? I get outmatched in my work because I have situations that I can't fix and I can't solve, and the resources in the community don't exist. So you're stuck, and so I get to the wall. I spent my whole life back and forth struggling between vast amounts of anxiety and fear. And when you're 5'4" and you're at an all-boys Catholic school, you're afraid to go to school. I was afraid to go to school. And that's never left me. I still have tremendous amounts of fear and anxiety because life is really tough and complicated, and I feel that burden. I figure on my good. I will quote you, C.S. Lewis, who said once, "We are like the bad tennis player who mistakes his rare successes for his normal." And I'm a tennis player, and you have an ego around your game, and isn't how you define your performance by your really glowing temporary results, but is that your average? I've made some great shots in my life, but do I do them every time? No, most of the time my backhand is awful. So in life, we make moment-to-moment decisions. Every moment, we're thinking, we're processing, we're acting, we're behaving. There's a million moments a day where we're here, and it all makes a difference. And I don't remember what your question was, so where am I with this?
You had come from, this Catholic boys' school, so you're getting scripture, you're getting this understanding of God, you're getting this calling. You come to Gonzaga, and you get involved here. You talk about your Vietnam experience with the girls' home. You had to work.
Yeah, I was 21 years old, freshly Gonzaga graduated, and I was in charge of 12 adolescent females aged 12 to 17 who were ex-prostitutes in Yakima and drug addicts, and I was in charge of them. Who won? Guess who won?
Guess it was tougher and stronger. They were, yeah.
Yeah, so we put the most inexperienced, most unqualified people in the trenches in social services. So those tough jobs are occupied by 21-year-old BA graduates. And the older you get and the more education experience, the farther removed. It's just like the military. You put the infantry, the 18-year-olds on the front lines, and the generals are back in an air-conditioned cottage. So I had a series of experiences in my career that brought me to my knees in terms of the toughness of the tragedy of people's lives. And, how do you respond? How do you talk to someone who's been through what some of these people have been through? And what can you say to make it better? My conclusion overall, especially at the House of Charity, is just presence. Last night on my way home, I got a call from my neighbor, Bert. He said, "Jerry, can you help? Betty's on the floor again." And I noticed during the hurricane we just had that it became apparent that Betty, who's in her 80s, is now falling in her living room when she gets up from her chair. And once she's on the floor, she's not going to get up unless Bert's in his 80s. And Bert's an awesome guy, the character, but he can't lift her. So she's just on the floor. And I hadn't put two and two together, but the paramedics had been arriving at that house multiple times in the previous months. And when I talked to Bert, he said, well, Betty is sick, and she, he would give me an answer. Truth is, they were calling 911 to help get her off the floor. And so last night I was able to go in and out very quick and help Betty off the floor and back into her chair. And then I said, see ya, call me next time. And I realized I really like, that's so simple. I can fix something in a matter of 15 seconds. I can use my strength and my neighborliness to get Betty off the floor back into her chair. And that can save the community a lot of money. and so it's all kind of comes around to that. It's those, there's many things I do that are not that simple. And no matter how much of the weight I take on, I cannot carry it. But in those instances, I can. So I guess my conclusion is we need to do those little things in our daily lives that can make a difference when we can, when we have the opportunity. We still need to battle the big issues to some degree, and we'll make them better. But I think it's those moment-to-moment little decisions. It's a smile, it's a welcome, it's acknowledging another human being. It's just a connection, it's presence. And that's what I've discovered, that's what it's all about. It's not rocket science. Making individuals' lives better or our community better or America better is all about presence. It's all about being there and supporting other human beings who are struggling. But not if it's all about me, not if it's about being consumed by just enriching our own selves. We have to shift a little. People always ask me, what should you do? What should we do for the people flying the signs? We'll work for food, and there's an effort to abolish that. There will be, in cities, there will be ordinances that do not allow people to hold those signs. When I was in San Francisco, a guy had a sign, and he had louvers on it and a string, and it had a paragraph, and then he pulled a string, and those billboards now that turn? This is San Francisco. Cool stuff. He had another message, and then he turned the board around, and while I was sitting for the light to turn green, I read an essay. It was kind of cool. I was tempted to give him some money just because that was clever. But people on the streets who have signs, it says my message, those are God's billboard to say to us, what are you doing with your stuff? For us to examine, what are we doing with our stuff? And so I don't want those people to go away. And yet, a lot of times they're using the money for drugs and alcohol. And we don't know. I remember getting in Bellevue, I was at a conference, and this woman, I came out of my motel room, and this woman came at me going and bawling her head off saying, I'm a victim of domestic violence. She told me her story in tears, and I gave her $5, and that's a one and only time that I've actually given money to someone in a situation. And I left, and it was kind of like, well, it may have been true, because that happens. People are fleeing domestic violence. Women are tortured, and she may have been one of them. Or she was making a lot of money, and she had a scam that was pretty dang good, because if she targeted males who are alone leaving their motel rooms in Bellevue, she might have been doing pretty well. But what do we know? What do we do? How do we know when we give our resources to strangers where they're going to go? We don't know what the outcome is, but it's letting go of the resource. It's giving it up and putting it out into the universe, into God's territory. That is the key issue. It's just letting go of it. What God does with it is God's business. We don't control that.
So, Jerry, if people here are like, I want to do more. I don't just want to, hand money to a guy on the sign. I want to get involved. I want to experience something. What kind of opportunities does Catholic Charities offer that just a standard volunteer can?
You can hold babies at the daycare center, or you can help people rake leaves who are elderly, or you can serve meals at the homeless shelter. There's a million ways. It's a matter of your gifts. What are your gifts? How do you want to share your gifts? And it's a gift exchange. Like The poor will give you things that are very, very important, and you can give them something that's very important that you have. Your talents. Again, my favorite thing is your presence. I have volunteers that come to House of Charity, and all they do is talk. They don't do anything other than listen and have conversations. And I have found that a lot of homeless people feel like lepers. They, when they're out on the streets, people cross over to the other side of the street when they're there, and the sense of rejection, the sense of I'm worthless, is immense. And so when I have volunteers come to the House of Charity and sit down with them, that's sort of an anomaly for their experience. That they're used to having people just look at them like you're nothing, you're worthless. Whether it's turning away, or whether it's throwing something at them, or spitting at them, or throwing money at them, or whatever people do. And some of you are so good to them, and you will give them things. And I'm not judging anybody, but I think just being there for people is what it's about. Just being there, being present, being alongside of them. A lot of our folks don't trust anybody, and they've had their trust broken by their own parents, by their own families, and so they're looking. Trust repair involves being consistent with somebody and rebuilding their trust, and that starts with just being there. Simple.
So someone could just come down to House of Charity at Pacific and Brown and walk in the door and say, I'd like to volunteer to help do something. They'll find a...
Yes and no. We have a background check, and we have although there's been volunteers that have been anonymous, and they come down on their own and don't tell anybody. But when you declare yourself as a volunteer, then we have a process by which we have an online application at CatholicCharities.org, and you indicate your interest, and we do a matching. But yeah, if you walked into the House of Charity and said you wanted to volunteer, we would fix you up. So there's formal and informal processes for that.
Well, Jerry, I want to thank you because you inspire us to think through, the world we live in, the society that we're in, the role we can play in it. Some of us are, some of us aren't, and to think through that, maybe if I'm going to follow God, He's going to have something deeper and richer for me to do than just make my own life comfortable. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today and your insights. Thank you very much. Would it be okay if we just prayed for Jerry as we conclude here? Well, why don't you stand, Jerry? Why don't we all just stand together? Lord, just thank you so much for Jerry. He stands here representing hundreds and hundreds of other people as well, who are giving up some of their own life dreams and their ambitions to serve you. And they're willing to go to places where there's the least and the lost, and they're an inspiration to us, reminding us that, God, you're at work in some dark places. You are at work with your glorious light, that you have healing that is going into places where the wounds run deep from ages past. I pray that you'll give Jerry strength and wisdom, and you'll give him insight. I pray that you'll surround him with the right people, Lord, who can make the vision and the mission, the goals, the calling that you've given him go ever higher, stronger, and further on. Lord, I pray for us that we will begin to reconsider ourselves in light of your truth and your glory, and what we can do to go to those who are hungry and thirsty, and who are in prison, and who are downtrodden, and who don't trust anymore, and who are wounded. May you awaken us to be agents of your love, using our hands and our feet, our eyes, our ears, our tongues, that we might become you, Jesus. May your Spirit reside on us, on Jerry. Thank you for the gift of Jerry to us today. I pray that you'll bless him accordingly in your holy name. Amen. Amen. Thank you guys for coming. We're going to be doing this next couple of weeks, talking to people who are the front lines, doing some really fascinating work with some difficult people. Jerry will stick around if you want to have a private conversation with him. Coffee bar is going to be open. Love to make a couple friends and say hi to you.